Why did Jesus write in the sand? The shocking truth revealed. One of the most intriguing and enigmatic episodes in the life of Jesus Christ is the moment when he stoops down and writes in the sand. This event, narrated in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, has been the subject of fascination, debate, and speculation for centuries. What did Jesus write? Why did he choose to write in the sand at that critical moment? What are the implications of this seemingly simple, yet deeply significant act? In this article, we will dive deep into this biblical episode, exploring its historical context, theological interpretations, cultural implications, and the lessons we can draw for our contemporary lives. Get ready for a fascinating journey that will unravel the layers of meaning behind this enigmatic act of Jesus. To fully comprehend the significance of Jesus' act of writing in the sand, we must first examine the historical and cultural context in which this event occurred. In the 1st century AD, Palestine was under the rule of the Roman Empire. Jewish society at the time was complex, with various religious and political factions competing for influence. The main groups included the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. Each of these groups had their own interpretation of the law of Moses and their own expectations about the role of the promised Messiah. Jesus' ministry took place in this turbulent setting. His actions and teachings often challenged established norms and traditional interpretations of the law, which put him in direct conflict with the religious authorities of the time. The law of Moses, as recorded in the book of Leviticus, prescribed the death penalty for cases of adultery. Leviticus 20 verse 10 states, "If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be put to death." However, in practice, the application of this law in the 1st century was complex and often inconsistent. Roman occupation had limited the authority of Jewish leaders to carry out death sentences, and there were considerable debates among different factions on how to interpret and apply Mosaic laws in a changing society. It is in this context that the famous episode of the woman caught in adultery occurs, narrated in John 8 verses 1 to 11. The passage begins with Jesus teaching in the temple. The scribes and Pharisees bring to him a woman caught in adultery. They place her in the middle of the crowd and say to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" This was clearly a test, a trap set for Jesus. If he agreed to the execution, he could be accused of usurping Roman authority, which reserved for itself the right of executions. If he opposed the execution, he could be accused of contradicting the law of Moses. It is at this critical moment that Jesus stoops down and begins to write in the sand with his finger. Jesus' act of writing in the sand is described succinctly in the biblical text, but Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. John 8 verse 6. This unexpected action immediately draws attention. Why did Jesus choose this moment to write? What was he writing? Why doesn't the Gospel author tell us the content of the writing? These questions have intrigued scholars, theologians, and believers for centuries. Let's explore some of the most significant interpretations. Throughout church history, many different interpretations have been proposed to explain Jesus' act of writing in the sand. Let's examine some of the most prominent ones. The sins of the accusers. A popular interpretation suggests that Jesus was writing the sins of the accusers in the sand. This theory is based on Jesus' subsequent response, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." John 8 verse 7. According to this interpretation, by writing the sins of the accusers, Jesus was exposing their hypocrisy and reminding them of their own need for mercy. This interpretation resonates with Jesus' teaching in Matthew 7 verses 3 to 5 about the importance of examining our own faults before judging others. The law of Moses. Another theory suggests that Jesus was writing relevant parts of the law of Moses. This could include not only the law on adultery, but also other passages that speak about the importance of mercy and justice. For example, he could have been writing Deuteronomy 17 verse 7, which states that the witnesses to a crime should be the first to cast stones in the execution. This interpretation sees Jesus' action as a way of reaffirming the law while challenging the selective and hypocritical application of it by the accusers. A prophetic gesture. Some scholars see Jesus' action as a prophetic gesture, similar to the symbolic acts performed by Old Testament prophets. In this interpretation, the act of writing in the sand could be a reference to Jeremiah 17 verse 13, which says, "All who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust because they have forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water." By writing in the sand, Jesus would be symbolically declaring that those who rejected him and clung to a legalistic interpretation of the law were, in fact, turning away from God. A moment of reflection. A more practical interpretation suggests that Jesus was simply buying time and creating a moment for reflection. By stooping down and writing, he changed the dynamics of the situation, diverting attention from himself and the accused woman. This moment of pause may have given the accusers a chance to reconsider their actions and intentions. A demonstration of literacy. Some scholars argue that the act of writing was itself a significant demonstration. In a society where literacy was limited, especially among the lower classes, the fact that Jesus could write could be seen as an affirmation of his authority and knowledge. An act of compassion. Another interpretation sees the act of writing in the sand as a gesture of compassion towards the accused woman. By stooping down, Jesus avoided eye contact with her, sparing her from further shame and public humiliation. Jesus' response. Regardless of what Jesus wrote, his verbal response to the accusers is deeply significant. Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. John 8 verse 7. With these words, Jesus effectively turned the situation around. Instead of judging the woman or falling into the trap set for him, Jesus turned the focus back on the accusers, challenging them to examine their own lives and motivations. The text tells us that after hearing these words, the accusers began to leave one by one, starting with the older ones. This detail is significant, suggesting that those with more life experience were the first to recognize the wisdom and truth in Jesus' words. When all the accusers had left, Jesus addressed the woman, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" To which she replied, "No one, sir." Jesus then declared, "Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." John 8 verses 10 to 11. Theological implications. This episode has profound theological implications that continue to resonate today. The tension between justice and mercy. The incident powerfully illustrates the tension between the justice of the law and God's mercy. Jesus does not deny the reality of the woman's sin, nor does he minimize its gravity. However, he demonstrates that God's mercy is greater than our sins and that judgment without mercy does not reflect God's heart. The universality of sin. By challenging the sinless to cast the first stone, Jesus highlights the universality of sin. This is a recurring theme in his teachings and in the writings of the New Testament. As Paul would later write, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Romans 3 verse 23. Jesus' authority. The episode demonstrates Jesus' authority to forgive sins, a prerogative that, in Jewish tradition, belonged exclusively to God. By declaring, "Neither do I condemn you," Jesus is effectively assuming the role of divine judge, an implicit affirmation of his divinity. The nature of true justice. Jesus demonstrates that true justice is not just about punishing evil, but about restoring and redeeming. His approach to the adulterous woman is not one of condemnation, but of restoration. Go now and leave your life of sin. The hypocrisy of judgment. The incident exposes the hypocrisy of those who are ready to condemn others while ignoring their own sins. Jesus teaches that true repentance and humility are prerequisites for just judgment. Contemporary applications. Although this episode occurred 2,000 years ago, its lessons remain deeply relevant to our contemporary society. Judgment on social media. In our era of social media, where it's easy and common to judge and condemn others publicly, Jesus' example calls us to a reflective pause. Before casting stones in the form of critical comments or sharing defamatory content, we are challenged to examine our own lives and motivations. Restorative justice. The model of justice demonstrated by Jesus, which seeks to restore rather than just punish, has significant implications for our criminal justice systems. Many advocates of restorative justice see in this episode a biblical foundation for approaches that seek rehabilitation and reintegration of offenders, rather than just punishment. Compassion for the marginalized. Jesus' compassion for the adulterous woman, who would have been one of the most marginalized people in her society, challenges us to look with compassion on the marginalized in our own society. Who are the modern adulterers that our society is ready to condemn? How can we extend grace and compassion to them, following Jesus' example? The importance of self-reflection. Jesus' challenge to the accusers to examine their own lives before judging others is a powerful call to self-reflection. In a world where it's easy to point out others' mistakes, we are invited to look inward and deal with our own sins and shortcomings. The power of forgiveness. The forgiveness offered by Jesus to the adulterous woman reminds us of the transformative power of forgiveness. In a society often characterized by bitterness, resentment, and desire for revenge, Jesus' example calls us to a culture of forgiveness and reconciliation. Balance between grace and truth. Jesus demonstrates a perfect balance between grace and truth. He extends mercy to the woman, but also encourages her to leave her life of sin. This balance is a challenge for us today, calling us to be people who speak the truth in love, who don't compromise moral standards, but who also extend grace to those who have failed. The episode of Jesus writing in the sand is much more than a historical curiosity or a theological enigma. It is a deeply revealing moment that offers us valuable insights into God's character, the nature of true justice, and our role as followers of Christ in a broken world. The shocking truth revealed in this incident is not so much the content of what Jesus wrote in the sand, but the profound revelation of God's heart that this act represents. We see a God who stoops down to the broken, who challenges the self-righteous, who offers mercy without compromising truth. As we reflect on this episode, we are challenged to examine our own lives. Where are we ready to judge others without mercy? Where do we need to experience and extend God's forgiveness? How can we live in a way that balances grace and truth in our daily interactions? Jesus' act of writing in the sand remains a powerful reminder that God's kingdom operates in ways that often challenge our expectations and our human justice systems. It invites us to a deeper and more transformative way of living, where mercy triumphs over judgment and where God's love is the motivating force behind all our actions. May we, like the adulterous woman, find ourselves face to face with Jesus' surprising grace. And may we, like the accusers, have the humility to recognize our own need for mercy. Above all, may we be transformed by Jesus' example, becoming agents of His grace and truth in a world that desperately needs both.